You're listening to Innovators, the podcast from Harris Search Associates, where we speak with global leaders in education, research, engineering, and the health sciences, and ask them to share lessons learned as they continue to advance the frontiers of innovation and discovery. Today's podcast will be led by Joanne Fax, Senior Consultant.
Of late, colleges and universities have been roiled by controversies involving intercollegiate athletics, sexual harassment and assault, and endowment investment practices. Incidents on many university campuses involving gun deaths are no longer rare. Many of these events present crises for university leaders, and some of whom struggle to cope and manage them well. But communications are not only about crises. So we are fortunate to have with us today Dr. Joseph Brennan, who will from here on be called Joe, a public relations professional who specializes in working with colleges and universities. He was Vice President of Communications at the Universities of Iowa, Buffalo, and Albany, and also served in executive communication roles at Ohio University, the University of the Pacific, and the University of Toledo. One of the things we're very impressed with is he is a fellow of the Public Relations Society of America, a distinction conferred on only 400 of the society's 25,000 members. So welcome, Dr. Brennan, to Innovators, or Joe, as I should be calling you.
Thank you, Joanne. I'm delighted to be here.
So we're going to jump right in. When I attended college back in the, I hate to say Middle Ages, but a while ago, I don't recall a vice president of communications or marketing. What happened at colleges and universities to establish the need for these positions? And also, how and when did strategic communications become so important?
Well, Joanne, higher education is just under tremendous pressure these days. There are forces that are headwinds against our institutions, demographic, economic, political, and social forces. And I think institutions are responding by saying, hey, we need to have smart, strategic, effective communications that helps us build relationships and build trust. You know, I talked about those forces, demographic forces, for example. The proportion of the U.S. society that is traditional college age, 18 to 24, has gone down quite a bit in the last 15 years. And in fact, it'll continue to decline for another few years, and then it'll slowly recover. So there are just fewer traditional age students. There's a lot of economic pressure too. As state support for public institutions has declined in the last 20 years, that has been made up for by tuition increases. And I think we're at a point now where families and students are unwilling to keep paying a higher and higher and higher tuition rate every year. So you've got economic pressures. Those economic pressures lead to political pressures too, as taxpayers turn to their representatives and say, please help make college more affordable. And of course, we're in the middle of this very challenging times in our society in America, where it seems like people are more polarized and less trustful of each other. So all those things together just create tremendous pressure on these institutions.
One aspect of a communications vice president in higher ed is to deal with crises that can unfortunately take place on and off campuses. Given the climate in today's world, we know that crises will happen because, as we say, not if, but when they will happen, because every university is going to face something in the next few years. So what are the various roles that come with the position of a communications vice president these days?
Well, Joanne, you're so right. These things are unpredictable, they're highly disruptive, and just look at the headlines. They're happening all around us all the time. That's why communications leaders in higher education need to understand what are the tasks of leading an institution through crisis so that they can support their president, their chancellor, their board chair going through these very, very difficult experiences. You know, and it seems to me after almost 30 years in this business, colleges and universities seem especially vulnerable to crisis. it's almost as if these institutions were purposefully designed to produce crises. I mean, think about it. Our campuses are wide open, both physically and intellectually. We welcome people from all different backgrounds with varying ideas, varying experiences, varying agendas, and we create a place where, on purpose, these ideas and these people come together into contact. But that openness, which is so healthy for our academic life, also poses the risk of easy access for criminals, sad to say. I always wonder a little when I hear the media say that University of X is on lockdown. I've never been on a campus that you actually could lock down. The buildings are spread out, they're wide open, and we did that deliberately. So what are the tasks of leading an institution through crisis? Now, I want to say that crisis leadership is not the same as crisis management. Crisis management means the fire truck went to the correct address. Crisis leadership is something entirely different. And it starts with making sense out of what's happening. When there's a critical incident, you don't have enough information, you don't have it fast enough, but you have to take what you've got and make sense out of it. We encourage leaders to ask questions like, what's happening right now? What's changed in the last 24 hours? What impact is it having on our operations? What is being done to help support victims? What is being done to address the underlying problem? So first, making sense. Very quickly, that becomes decision-making. Crises often unfold as a series of what do we do next problems, sometimes at a very rapid pace. What do we do in a half an hour? What do we do 10 minutes from now? The third task, and this is a critical one that I spend a lot of time on in my practice, and that is making meaning. When a critical incident strikes an organization, it's disruptive to the values. It threatens the values, and leaders need to reassert those values. A quick example, when I worked at the University of Iowa, we were shocked and surprised when a visiting artist erected a statue on campus without forewarning to anyone. The statue was a 7-foot tall effigy of a Ku Klux Klansman. And people just walked onto campus and saw this, and you can imagine how the responses were: shocked, angry, upset, threatened. Why is there a Ku Klux Klan statue on our campus? That particular incident reminds us that there's a value on our campuses of inclusivity and diversity and welcoming people from all backgrounds. There's another value too about freedom of speech, and this artist thought he was exercising his freedom of expression. So you've got two values that come into conflict. It's an important role for a leader to make meaning in those kinds of situations. Leaders also have to end the crisis. In every time and place, there's a moment when people are ready to let go and ready to move on to return to normality. That's an important part of the grieving and recovery process that we all go through as human beings. If you make that happen too quickly, though, it's not good. I think we can all remember when the Deepwater Horizon oil rig exploded and killed and maimed workers. It was a terrible tragedy. But the chief executive officer of the oil company that owned that structure, about 2 weeks later, was quoted in the media as saying, "I'm ready for this to be over. I want my life back." Within several days of that comment, he was no longer the chief executive officer because the board and the stakeholders and the public simply decided that was moving the ending too fast. But good leaders know how to bring things to an end and bring people back to normality. And then after the crisis, good leaders assure that the organization has learned from the incident. There's always something we could learn. What could we do better? How could we have prevented this? And that cycles into the sixth critical task of leadership, which is preparing. Leaders assure that institutions are ready for the next time, have good plans, well-rehearsed people, and that risks are identified and mitigated where possible, and resources are positioned to address crises that you can't prevent.
I appreciate your explaining the complexities of the position, because it does show that you have so many people to address and communicate with, and to ensure the integrity of the institution, the integrity of the leadership as well. So it really is a very important role. Through lessons learned, a phrase that comes up often in the aftermath of a crisis at a university. One of your articles showed you called the president's office a, quote, endangered species. And I got a good chuckle out of that, because it is true that so many people have been let go of their positions because they didn't handle a lot of these emergent situations very well. So as you reflect on the years during which any number of crises have taken place at and within institutions, what are the lessons you would urge university presidents and trustees to learn and take to heart? Both of these roles, both as leaders and as boards, are important, but their roles may be very different. Maybe explain the best practices for each.
And, I wanted to come back to something you said a moment ago about how crises threaten careers. Of course, they cost time, they cost money. In the worst cases, they cost people's lives, but they also cost leaders their jobs. And some research done by Southern Methodist University a couple of years ago looked at the reasons why college presidents were fired, sort of involuntary separations, if you will, over the last 25 years. And, I think a lot of us would think, well, maybe it had to do with being a poor manager of the finances of the institution. But in fact, financial issues were only 1 in 5 of the reasons why a president was fired by a board. The rest generally involved broken relationships, conflicts with the board, campus dissatisfaction, crises and controversies around athletics, or getting caught up in political issues that are larger than the campus. And I would say that all of those reputational problems are crises in and of themselves. Now, presidents need to be skillful at managing reputational risk. And here's a challenge. Most of the crisis management that we see on campuses are driven by people who come out of the first responder world. And that's very important, right? I want to make sure that the police get to the site of the active shooter and immobilize that threat. That's critical.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But the first responder mentality often has no experience in managing a reputational crisis. Number two, a lot of our presidents come out of an academic background and they don't have the training. In fact, the academic culture, and I think you've spent a lot of time in and around campuses, and you know this, academic culture values slow, thoughtful decision-making. Not going to help you in a crisis, because the one thing you don't have is enough time. Academic culture values getting everybody's input. Hey, we can't do that when the building's on fire, right? Someone has to make a decision and make it fast with incomplete information. So sadly, our academic leaders are often unprepared, and the people that they're looking to for guidance and advice are coming from a first responder orientation. So what do you do, right? Well, I often think that the beginning of this is that you have to understand your campus needs to be prepared, and you as a president need to be very involved in that preparation. You do not delegate this. You insist that the people who report to you become crisis experts with a crisis mindset. The president also needs to have people around her who will bring multiple perspectives. And often the attorney is at that table, but the attorney is only thinking about one thing, and that is managing legal risk. You need other people there who will think about managing other kinds of risks, like reputational risks. A good public relations counselor, for example, will think more broadly about more audiences and more categories of risk than an attorney. I mentioned the importance of speed. Speed kills when you're managing a crisis. Higher ed moves very predictably and slowly. Crises don't. So presidents have to encourage their people and position them to act and speak without a lot of cumbersome approval process. I also talk about the big picture. It's important for the leader to maintain a very big picture, not get caught up in too many details. The leader needs to have that holistic view and delegate some of the detail management to others. And then a final point that I'll make is I like to say it's not over until it's over. Like Yogi Berra said, it's not over until it's over. I've seen many times throughout my career leaders who really are ready to be done with the crisis. They're ready to pivot back to normality. But guess what? We don't get to decide that. Who decides when it's over? Well, the victims decide primarily. The news media decides, right? The courts decide. The last person to be able to decide this thing's over and we can go back to normal is actually the chief executive officer. So being patient, being willing to ride it out. I always say, look at Kent State University. The shootings on the Kent State campus happened in 1970. We're still talking about it right, in 2018. So it's really not over for them. It's not over for Virginia Tech, which has an annual memorial service on the anniversary of its tragic shootings. So,
Joe, not to interrupt you, but I want you to think about I'm adding a question in terms of your response, in terms of should teams of people be trained to handle these crisis situations in addition to the vice president and the president, or vice president of communications and the president, or how best does the university prepare itself for handling these crises?
yes, absolutely. A good practice is to have a small core group of people who are really expert in this. And that group can roll out and respond to the majority of incidents that happen. But you also need to prepare a much larger group. If something really major should happen to you on your campus, you're going to need dozens of people. And there are good training programs out there. The Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, has some very, very good programs to prepare people to run the different aspects of a disaster, whether that's operations, finance, communications, any number of functions. You can train your people. So a practice that I've seen and that we've used at many of the campuses I've worked for is a small core group supplemented by a larger group that is trained and can be mobilized. Now that group often takes leadership from the small core group because they're less practiced in this. Super important to have exercises. And often people will say, well, we had an exercise, it was a tabletop drill. Tell me what you did in the tabletop drill. Well, we all sat around a conference table and someone read a scenario and then we talked about how we would respond. I think that's not enough. I think you actually have to have a simulation. When I worked at the University at Buffalo, we were very good at simulations. We had highly realistic scenarios where we knew the day that it would happen, but we didn't know what it was, and we had to go to work and just respond like we would in normal time. And we involved outside agencies like the Buffalo Fire Department, for example. So you got practice at working side by side with external agencies, just like you would in a real disaster. I can't overemphasize, Joanne, how important it is to practice these skills. They're not something we use normally in our jobs. And like the Navy SEALs say, you don't rise to the level of your expectations, you rise to the level of your preparations.
It brings back memories of working in administration and having things happen suddenly, as for instance, earthquakes that just come and you're sitting there eating lunch and you're way away from your office where all your people are. And, sometimes having that training and having that better understanding of how best to handle these situations can be really important.
Absolutely. You can't over prepare.
Of late, legislatures at both state and federal levels of government are questioning the value of a college education and are very critical of the ways by which colleges and universities are led and administered. Are the criticisms and questions failures of communication and marketing on the part of institutions, or has higher ed simply not been able to adapt to some of the changes that disrupted so many sectors of society?
Joanne, I think the answer is both. There's no doubt that there's an increasing level of criticism of higher education by elected officials. Some of it perhaps deserved, and some of it perhaps not deserved. You can look at the statistics and you'll see that in almost all of our states, taxpayer support for our public universities has declined pretty dramatically in the last 20 years, forcing some share of the cost, a greater share of the cost, if you will, onto the families and students. And I think that sometimes elected officials aren't talking about that policy decision as much as they're talking about what a shame it is that institutions are raising their tuition prices. But you know, I think we also have to admit that the business model for so many of our institutions is broken. We have very high fixed costs, high labor costs, high physical plant costs. We're seeing these costs grow sometimes at rates outpacing inflation. We really can't shift that to our students and families anymore. We've got to find some new business models that will allow us to effectively deliver higher learning and manage our costs a little bit better. But it is tough. It is tough. We're a very traditional industry. We grant people guaranteed lifetime employment. We can't pivot in response to short-term fluctuations in our conditions. But nevertheless, I think that communication and marketing for our institutions is also part of the challenge. There was recently a survey of college presidents, and the majority, overwhelming majority, said the public really misunderstands higher ed. They don't understand how we're funded. They don't understand how we operate, why our costs are what they are. And, you know, I would agree with that, but I would also say to these presidents, but what are you doing, Madam President, to address that problem? Because on too many campuses, we've got communications that are reporting in at the wrong place. They're not reporting to the chief campus officer. They're reporting into a fundraiser or someone else who doesn't have that bigger picture, right? We're also seeing that these organizations are not positioned to be strategic communications, but rather they're asked to be telegram offices. Here's my message, please send this message. Good communication is two-way and not a one-way Mad Men sales operation. And then the last problem that I see so often is that all of the dollars and resources that are expended on communication and marketing across our institutions, and this can be considerable expenditures, the majority of those dollars are not in the hands of the chief communications and marketing officer. Many, many studies have shown the CMO for higher ed often can only control 5 to 10% of the total spend. Think how ineffective and wasteful that is when we've dispersed these resources rather than concentrated them, which will give us a chance to have greater efficiency and better impact. So I'm encouraging, and I'm speaking out to university presidents to say it's really time to think differently about communication. It needs to be led by a pro, needs to be reported into you or a very senior person, so it can serve institution-wide and not be the handmaiden of fundraising or some other function. And fortunately, I'm seeing many presidents adopt this new thinking, but we've still got a ways to go.
Are we catching up, or do you think, are we moving too slowly, or how do you feel about that? And then short answer, just.
You know, I'm seeing more and more positions being posted for chief communications and marketing officers reporting directly to a chancellor or directly to a president. But yet at the same time, I'm seeing new presidents come in and take a chief marketing officer position and do away with it and report the function into the advancement officer, which is a model that almost virtually guarantees that your communications work will be primarily focused on fundraising. Yeah. Fundraising is important. We absolutely need it. It's the margin of excellence that allows us to be affordable and high quality. But you know, it's only a piece of what we do, and good communications thinks about the entire institution and tries to touch every single stakeholder group. So 2 steps forward, 1 step back, I think is where we're at today.
Fake news. You know, we can't let you go without talking a little bit about fake news. It's a term we've all come to hear quite frequently. And since we're in an age of fake news with photographs and videos doctored to misrepresent what was actually captured on camera, news reports that turn out to be part fact and then part fiction, and wholly invented stories that nevertheless go viral in seconds and take on lives of their own, be there truth or non-truth. How can colleges and universities cope better with fake news things that happen, either through social media, through things that happen on campus, through videos? What's their best approach?
Our first primary job as educational institutions is to make sure we are teaching our students how to understand the information that's being presented to them. One of my colleagues at the University of Albany, Trudy Jacobson, is a leader in this area. She talks about a concept called meta-literacy. So literacy means, can you read and write? Information literacy means, can you find and gather information? But meta-literacy means, are you able to think about your own thinking? Do you understand how you encounter sources of information? And if we can teach students to think this way, to ask critical questions, to think about their own biases, you know, because we all tend to believe information that is corresponding to our own preconceived values and philosophy and understanding of the world. That's called the confirmation bias. It's a well-known problem in psychology. So we have an academic and educational job to do, number one. Number two, we also have a job to do to make sure we as institutions are maintaining trust. You know, trust is at an all-time low. There's a very good public relations agency called Edelman, and every year they do a global survey of trust. They've done it for almost 40 years, and they do it in dozens of countries. And it's sad, but every year, the percentage of people who say they trust institutions, like governments and the news media and churches and universities, every year the proportion of people who trust goes down. So we have to own trust. We've got to walk the talk. How often can you think about an institution where we learned about some horrible or scandalous thing going on? And you know, it seems like the people who worked there and the leaders knew about it all along. We can't pull the veil over it. We need to walk our talk.
Okay, my last question for you today. You've had considerable experience in higher education and have no doubt seen change. What are some of the innovations colleges and universities have created or adapted for their use to enact this change?
You know, Joanne, I'm so excited about the innovations that are happening on our campuses. People like to somehow believe that higher ed doesn't change. It's very conservative. Higher ed is the birthplace of every major innovation in our society for the last 100 years. They've come out of our American colleges and universities. One of the things that excites me the most as an educator is we're innovating how we deliver education, online learning, and micro courses that people can do in quick bursts to fit busy schedules and get a credential for that. In our classrooms as well, many educators are now flipping the model, and it's not lecture, take notes, take a test like it was perhaps when you and I were students. It's let's get engaged with this material. Let's go out into the field and apply these things. Let's reflect on what we're learning. John Dewey, the great American philosopher, said, we learn best by doing. And more and more on our campuses, we are seeing this experience-based learning going on. I'm also excited by the insights that people are bringing in from the emerging field of brain science, or it's called neuroscience. We're understanding much better how the wiring and chemistry of our brains and nervous systems actually shape how we perceive the world. And we're starting to bring that in into the world of communication in a little bit more thoughtfully. We're engaging people based on their motivations, needs, and interests. So, for example, at the University at Albany, we spent some time surveying our students and the students who wanted to apply there to try to understand their needs and motivations and interests. And then we tailored our messages to serve those people better. Rather than a sales pitch, we showed them the information that they needed based on who they were as people and not as some generic potential student. So I'm really excited about the opportunity that neuroscience and technology can give us to communicate with people as human beings on a one-on-one basis.
If you're interested, you can hear more from Dr. Brennan. You can go to www.josephbrennan.com. And we thank you, Joe, so much for being with us today on Innovators.
This was a real pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to Innovators, a production of Harris Search Associates. We'll have more insightful conversations with global thought leaders to follow.